at Care Oregon, and we chatted, and he's going to give a much more detailed introduction of himself because although I consider us friends already.
I know.
All right, so welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm a little tall for this thing. We'll see how this works. Well, thank you so much for having me. I can already tell you guys are a fun group, which I like. I presented yesterday to about 30 pediatric nurses. I don't know if you know pediatric nurses, but they're a tough crew with not a lot of laughter in that room. I got them warmed up a little bit at the end, but you know, they're a very serious group of folks. So I'm excited to be here with you guys. A few things before I even introduce myself. So, you know, the content that we're going to talk about is around trauma-informed care. And, you know, it's hard to talk about trauma-informed care without talking about trauma. So if, you know, you feel triggered at all or anything comes up for you, you know, you really want to take care of yourself. I can't stress that enough. Don't worry about content or anything. Like, you want to take care of yourself. There's a lovely concept called trauma mastery that we talk a lot about in my department. And that's really that people who come into this work oftentimes have trauma histories. I'm not excluded from that group. And so therefore when we talk about those things, sometimes we get triggered ourselves. And so you really want to take care of yourself because that's the most important thing. And then I don't know, Joe, if you want to say more about that, but.
Only if you feel like you need to leave the room because something going on is making you feel triggered, feel free to leave. And take care of yourself. If you're leaving the room for any other reason, please give me either a thumbs up or give me some eye contact so I know that you're doing okay. But if you just leave and you just leave the room, then I'm probably going to follow you out there to make sure you're doing okay.
Awesome. Other things. What are other things we should say? I think that's good. So a little bit about me to get us started here. So this is the problem. I'm gonna move. Okay, they gave me 2 mics. And it's not because I'm special. I just can't sit still. So as we were saying, so I'm the director of clinical operations for Care Oregon. I actually run a department of about 120 people called the Population Health Department. And in that department, we have a variety of programs that work directly with clients. So we have our Health Resilience Program, which Talk now is the manager for. And that's a team of about 32 social workers who are embedded in primary care doing super intensive case management work with our members. We have a Transitions in Care program helping folks who are hospitalized transition from hospital to home. And then we also have a housing team, so it's exciting to hear about housing that you guys have. We have a housing placement team. We have a team that's embedded in large mental health buildings called the Healthy Housing Team, and so they work with members who are living in those buildings. We have a really large telephonic care coordination team called the Exceptional Needs Care Coordination Team, ENCC. And that's about, I'm going to say there's probably 30 of them now as well. And then we are always trying to expand and do more true population health. So trying to figure out how do we help our members, we call them members, live the most productive and healthiest lives that they can. We are now the largest Medicaid health plan in Oregon. And so we serve a lot of folks who come to us with lots of trauma histories, lots of chronic illnesses. So we're constantly talking about how to do better and support our folks. So I am a mental health therapist by trade, and I also am a certified clinical trauma professional. So that just means I have extra coursework and certification in trauma treatment. And I've kind of done a lot of different stuff in my career. I'm this person who likes to do tons of different things and learn new things and work in different across the lifespan. So I worked with little kids all the way from preschool up until adulthood for sure. I worked with families a lot. I was a previous director in community mental health at Cascadia Behavioral Health, so I was there for about 8 years. I really actually ran a homeless youth program that they had there for about 8 years. And then I decided after doing that I really wanted to do something totally different. I wanted to get out of the Medicaid space. I was feeling a little bit burned out, so I went to private school, and I worked at a private school here in Portland for about 5 years, and I helped develop their counseling program for their pre-K through 5th grade students. And, you know, it's this fun delusion that you think, oh, I just can't do this work anymore. I'm going to go work with, like, rich people, and they don't have problems, right? And that'll be lovely. And of course, what I learned is the problems are all the same. Unfortunately, for them, it's even sometimes a little bit harder because it's buried and it's secretive. And there's a lot of money that gets thrown around to keep it under wraps. And so I actually struggled probably more with that than I did in my previous work because I wasn't allowed to talk about someone's anxiety. I wasn't allowed to talk about someone's depression. And if I did, then they would threaten to pull money out of the foundation for the school. So that didn't work out well for me. But I did do it for 5 years and I did enjoy it. But then I said, you know, I gotta do something else. So I went into private practice, and I was in private practice for about 5 years. And I really enjoyed the clinical work of private practice. I love clinical work, so it was amazing. But it was very, very lonely. I have learned that I like to work with people. I like to work with teams. And when it's just you in an office, you're not funny. No one's laughing at your jokes. There's no one to tell when you had a great session or when you had a bad session. And so I started to really look around to say, I can't do this for the rest of my life. And that was really what took me to Care Oregon, is at the time, Care Oregon had the health resilience program that was pretty new, and they were doing a ton of intensive case management work, but in a trauma-informed way. And being a health plan, they have a lot more flexibility to do that because they don't have to have, you know, billable time. They don't have to have all those restrictions that we did certainly in community mental health. And it was so awesome to think, wow, we can work with people and we can work with them for however long we need to, for the time that we need to. We can do the things we need to, and do it in a way that feels very respectful to their histories that they bring to the table. So it was super exciting to do that. And so I went to Care Oregon to manage the health resilience program originally, and it's still such an awesome experience and fun place to be. I never thought I'd work for a health plan, and it's unlike any health plan I think that's out there, which is pretty exciting. So my journey has been kind of interesting in that process, but always the thread has been trauma-informed care, and I have found it to be so powerful and useful in everything I do, in my own personal life, in raising my kids, in working with colleagues, in working with clients and members, because we all come to this universe and this world with something. And so it's really helpful to know that we're all starting in that spot and just to be mindful of how to treat each other. So I've always found trauma-informed care to be pretty awesome in that way. So before I get to anything else, though, I want to know more about you guys so I can kind of tailor this. I also am thrilled that I'm following the HIPAA training you had, because following HIPAA is pretty awesome. Because anything I do is pretty great, right? I mean, I hope. Oh my God, can you imagine if it was worse than HIPAA? And we're like, oh my God, give me HIPAA training. This is horrible. I have to drag my whole department through a HIPAA training in a couple weeks, so I feel that pain a little bit. Necessary, but a little painful. So can someone tell me a little bit more about the teams that are here? Just kind of what teams are here and how do you work with clients? And just whoever wants to start would be awesome. So I can get a gauge. For saying that, I really appreciate it. Yeah, and it's I said I wasn't going to be political. I'm not going to be super political, I promise. I promised I wouldn't be. But I just want to highlight that remembering that being trauma-informed, and we're going to go into lots of material today, but being trauma-informed is about being aware of not only your internal system, but the people that you're working with, but beyond that, right? And I feel like we are living in a time in a world right now that just has an overlay of intensity, anxiety, fear, and so you know, we have our normal stuff anyway, but because we live in the world we live in right now, we kind of all feel it a lot more. And certainly the people we work with are feeling that a lot more, that uncertainty and fear. So it's just really important to, I think, highlight that when we're talking about trauma-informed care. So I do have a lot of material today. I have done workshops for 2 days, so I will do my best to kind of go through the points that are most important, but just to keep in mind it is an intro for today, so it's just kind of starting to level set. I've also found that the information we take in, depending on your familiarity, is a paradigm shift for certain people, and so it's hard to take in a lot of information. So I will do my best to kind of give you what you're looking for. But I would like to hear just quickly, like 1 through 5 on your hand, 1, 5, your own understanding of trauma-informed care. So 1 is, I know very, very little, or maybe you're a 0 and you know nothing. Most people know something. Or you're a 5 and you know a lot. That helps me gauge the content. So if you can just raise your hand 1 through 5, where people are. Okay. 1s, 2s, 3s. A lot of 3s. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That helps. So today, like I said, we're going to go through a lot of stuff, but we're going to start with some definitions. Always got to know what we're talking about. We're going to talk sometimes to dive into the neurobiology of trauma and do a good job. So I might give you a little teaser depending on what's going on. And then we'll do some closing and takeaways. I love that there is Play-Doh on the table. That is awesome. So please feel free to fidget and use that because it's really, really important to keep you engaged. And then there's big white pieces of paper on the table as well that we'll be doing an activity with in a little bit. And then it sounds like most people are working directly with clients of some sort, so that's really helpful to know as well. If for some reason you're a person and you're like, I never actually work directly with a client, just try to take this information in as yourself or stories you've heard or your colleagues, because once again, we all come to this place with our own stuff. So it's really important to find a way to connect to the material. All right, so what is trauma? So there are a million different definitions of trauma, and the one that I like to talk about comes out of Ross Greene's work. Ross Greene is a researcher who wrote a book called The Explosive Child. I don't know if anyone's heard that book, but kind of revolutionized the concept of regulation in kids. Before him, it was a lot of, well, kids are bad or kids are good, and you make kids be good or you make kids be bad. And what he talked about a lot was the neurobiology of how things work with kids in their brains and how kids actually need to learn to regulate. And he has this concept that we can push people down the continuum of not being able to adapt positively. So I say that trauma is any event that overwhelms the ability to cope. This also takes out a lot of the judgment that people put on trauma. I don't know if you've seen this or heard this or even thought this. I certainly have thought this, where I see someone who says they're traumatized, they tell me what their event was, and I'm like, it wasn't that big of a deal. Really? You're traumatized by that? And it takes that out because this is about your ability to cope. If I don't have great coping skills to begin with, and then I have an event, little, big, small, I could be traumatized by that event because I don't have anything to cope. I think about children, I think about babies. They don't have coping skills in that way, and so they can easily be traumatized. So it's really any kind of event that occurs that overwhelms your ability to adjust, to adapt, to cope. There's also complex and prolonged trauma. That's multiple events over time. So a lot of the folks that you're talking about probably have complex trauma in this way. So they have a traumatic event, and then that leads to another traumatic event, and on and on and on, right? So then you end up having a series and almost a lifelong time of trauma event. And then we have this concept of structural violence, which I was kind of alluding to a little bit, which is the ways in which our social structures create harm, and including this systematic oppression. So again, you are a refugee, you come to this country, and then you were put into the poverty system of the United States. That is an opportunity for more oppression, not to mention race, gender, all those kind of things. Can add up, and they do add up, and they greatly affect people that have any kind of trauma that they come into the system. So it's important to kind of know about those. And this concept that trauma can be experienced or it can be witnessed. So sometimes you may not have had a traumatic experience, but you witnessed a traumatic event, and therefore you are now traumatized. There's a concept in the helping profession called vicarious trauma. And that's just hearing stories of trauma can traumatize you. I'll never forget my first experience with vicarious trauma. I was working in residential treatment with chronically mentally ill kids. And at the time, so this is 20 plus years ago, at the time it was really not a trauma-informed place, right? I mean, we didn't know anything about trauma-informed care then. And we did these things called interventions, which were really about holding kids down. Holding them down while they screamed and yelled and, did all sorts of things until they were exhausted. And then we were like, okay, now you're calm, you can go back to your room. And it was at the time I knew, I was like, this is not right. We're making this way worse. But we had one kid in particular who I worked with that just had the worst trauma history. At the time, I had certainly heard. I've unfortunately heard worse since then. And I had worked with him for a number of, probably a year and a half, and just hearing the stories that he would tell me, reading his chart, all the horrific things that this poor kid had been through by the age of 8. And then I, went about my day. I went home that weekend. I was like, I'm just gonna chill out and watch a movie. Has anyone seen the movie Dancer in the Dark? Oh my gosh. Don't watch it if you don't want to be traumatized. It's a movie that has Bjork in it, who's very artistic anyway. But there's this scene where she's walking, I'm not giving anything away, but she's walking and it's like this sound, and it's like this institutional hallway, and there's just like this methodical music going. And I can tell you, I just suddenly started getting flashes of this kid's life, and all these, I totally lost it. And I ran out of my house, and I was just kind of running around the backyard, and I was losing it. And I was sitting by the fence, and I was like in a fetal position, because I was flashbacking on his life that I had never had. I never had his life. But I had heard his stories over and over and over. And in residential treatment, you really get to know them because you're just like living with them, essentially. And I remember out of that, I was like, wow, vicarious trauma really exists. This is legit stuff. At the time, my partner was very confused why I was running out of the house and screaming and wasn't sure what to do. He was a hairdresser, so he didn't really understand vicarious trauma in that way. So it can be witnessed or it can be experienced yourself, right? Although you could argue that if you're a hairdresser, you hear a lot of bad stuff too. It also can be historical, it can be generational, and it can really be this thing we call epigenetics, which is you can inherit trauma. This is a relatively new, in the last probably 4 years or so, concept that, but it makes sense. People experience trauma, your body changes, your system changes, your mind changes, your hormones change, and then you have children. Those things are passed on in an evolutionary sort of way. That's how humans have been, maybe arguably at the top of the food chain, is that we have adapted and grown. And so in that process, we are built to pass along to our children things to worry about, be scared about, run away from. So the epigenetics of trauma can be a real thing as well. And not to mention the historical and the generational trauma. So I'm growing up and I hear the trauma stories from my families. They act in ways that play out their trauma histories, and I experience those. So all of this to say that trauma is pervasive. You can't get away from it. None of us can get away from it. It exists everywhere, in every socioeconomic status, in every community. It looks different, it smells different, but it's trauma. All of us have it. And I always talk about, too, if you ever wonder about, and I don't want to ruin you for the rest of your life, but every movie, every book you read, I guarantee you has a trauma story in it. And that's because when we tell stories, it's the arc of trauma, right? I was good, something bad happened to me, I overcame that thing, and now I'm on the other side of it. That's the arc of storytelling. So now I've ruined you because everything you read, you're gonna be like, oh, that's about trauma. Oh, that's about trauma. I do that a lot. I make everyone around me crazy because I'm like, well, that's about their trauma, and that's why they're in that movie, you know? Every book I read, I'm like, oh yeah, that's trauma right there. But it is that. It's around us all the time. That's why we tell stories about it, right? Because we live it and we breathe it. So I'm going to give you a few statistics just around more about prevalence, like I said. So 60% of 0 to 17-year-olds experienced or witnessed maltreatment, bullying, and assault. That's a huge amount. This is a national study that was out. I would argue it's probably even more than that. But that's like big trauma, big T. But remembering that little t counts too. Expulsion rates are 3 times higher now for pre-K versus K through 12. That to me speaks to an epidemic in our country that we are expelling preschoolers, we're expelling, kindergartners, kids that don't have the ability to regulate and cope because they're experiencing other forms of trauma and things in their household. 50 to 79% of males who experience maltreatment prior to the age of 12 become involved in the juvenile justice system. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with this. I'm very familiar with this. Again, in this country, we are going to start, I hope, having a bigger conversation around that people aren't bad or good, but that people have had bad things happen to them, and therefore they adjust in maladaptive ways, and that gets them into all sorts of trouble. And then talk about another opportunity for re-traumatizing. I had a really abusive history. I go into the prison system. It is built to re-traumatize you. You get out of that system with no resources, and then you are again in a system that's going to re-traumatize you. And we wonder why people tend to go back into the juvenile system or into the prison system after they've been released. Incarcerated women are more likely to report history of child abuse. This is pretty prevalent as well. If you talk to women who are in prison, they will tell you, this started when I was a kid. Any questions so far? I'm not someone who doesn't take questions, by the way. And if I'm driving you crazy by moving, let me know. You're like, I'm getting dizzy, I don't know what's going on. Yeah, so feel free to stop me if you have a question. So what is trauma-informed care? So now we have a concept of trauma. What is trauma-informed care? So trauma-informed care is a framework that involves understanding and recognizing, responding to the effects of all types of trauma. Trauma-informed care also emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both consumers and providers, and helps survivors rebuild a sense of control. So I highlighted a couple pieces here that are important to note about what trauma-informed care is. It is a framework. That's really important to know. It's not trauma treatment. It's not a solution to someone's trauma history. It is a framework for thinking about people and the behaviors that you're witnessing or experiencing or trying to work with. It's a framework for that. And it's all about safety. If you learn nothing else from today, it's about learning how to see something in front of you and establish or create safety for that person, physically, emotionally, however we need to do that. And that it's about giving people power and control that's appropriate for them to have. People who have power and control feel more safe, and therefore they are more regulated and act in ways that feel a little more typical for us. So those are really important concepts in trauma-informed care, is that people who are feeling traumatized or triggered oftentimes feel unsafe, or they feel like they don't have power and control. And we'll do an exercise later that will help you kind of brainstorm how do you do that for people, because it's great in this ethereal concept, but how do you really do that for people? Is really important. And how do you do it when you have other things going on in your life? Or how do you do it when you yourself are feeling a little triggered? I don't know about you, has anyone here felt triggered by a client they work with? Yeah, I mean, definitely. And so we have a really tough job because we have to regulate ourselves, help build this trust with this person, help regulate them. It's a tall order. That's why all of us are exhausted when we go home. So, as I said, trauma-informed care is a lens, it's not a treatment. This sometimes trips people up when I talk about trauma-informed care, because they'll start to say things like, well, do I need to know everything about their trauma history? Should I ask them about their trauma history? Should I find out what kind of trauma they have? So those are all things left in the realm of trauma treatment. You don't need to do any of that. And in fact, you don't need to know anything about their trauma history. You may because of the work you're in, but you don't need to in order to help them in a trauma-informed way. So that sometimes helps people a lot. It's this concept of practicing what I call universal precautions. I don't know if anyone works in the medical world. Does anyone work in the medical field at all? Okay. That's why my pediatric nurse joke kind of went, because you guys are like, I don't know any pediatric nurses. So universal precautions is this idea that when you are medically working with a person, that you enter into that space believing that they have some sort of infectious contagion. And then you treat them as a way, if you believe that, then you're going to act in a cautious way to keep yourself safe, whether they have that thing or not. So that's about using rubber gloves, that's about, avoiding any kind of fluids, those kind of things are practicing universal precautions. So again, you don't need to know if they have some sort of infectious disease because you protected yourself and every interaction you have with people that you don't have to worry about it. So this is also about practicing universal precautions from a trauma-informed care perspective. Assume everybody you come in contact with has a trauma history of some sort and act as if they do. If by some miracle they got out of that horrible thing that happens to lots of us, then awesome. They're just going to think you're a really nice person who gives them power and control and safety and all that, right? But if they're a traumatized person, which 9 times out of 10 they will be, they're gonna respond hopefully in a different way for you. So it's about practicing those universal precautions. And then it's understanding people who experience a traumatic life are oftentimes very sensitive to situations that remind them of people, places, things involved in their traumatic event. Call it a trigger, right? Again, think of biology. If your body wants to protect you from something, it's going to make you hyper aware of everything. And therefore, you can get triggered by things that you don't even know is happening for you. A good example of this is my son, he's 10, and we adopted him from South Korea. And he, for the first 2 years of his life, was in 2 different foster care systems, kind of going back and forth. His mom drank a lot when he was in utero, so he has fetal alcohol effects. So his brain doesn't quite work like a typical, neurotypical brain. But he doesn't have the facial features of fetal alcohol, so he looks normal. And so people are oftentimes kind of taken aback by some things he does because they're a little quirky. And we've worked since he was 2 on regulation, helping him regulate, helping him calm his nervous system. Because he would get triggered all the time and react as a triggered person, but not have any concept in his brain about what it was, right? And so then he would write a story for himself, which is, I'm a bad person. So a good example is when we first got him, and I'm a child and family therapist, so you have to forgive me. We don't always do what we say. So when we first got him, he was having a big fit, and I did this thing where I put him in his room and I shut the door, and I walked out because I was like, I'm gonna let him just scream it out. Well, as anyone who has any sense, and I did not, knows that a kid who has that kind of attachment, probably not a good idea to detach yourself from them in the moment. So what does he do? He gets bigger, he gets louder, he starts breaking things, right? And then I get more dysregulated, I get more frustrated. And I want to remove myself away from him more. So you see the cycle that it creates. And it wasn't until I finally clued in that I was like, this is about him being triggered. This is about his attachment. I need to handle this differently. And so what I started doing with him is I would sit in the room, because he was kind of like a wild animal at this point. So it wasn't that I could get near him. He didn't want me near him, although that's probably exactly what he needed in the moment. And so I would just sit in the room, and I would just talk really calmly, and I would regulate myself. And I just say, I'm ready when you are. I'm here if you want a hug. I'm here for a hug. If you need help breathing, I'll help you breathe. And over time, we got to that place where he would let me hold him, and we would breathe together. We would regulate ourselves or regulate him. And over time now, it's beautiful because they don't last very long at all. And he asks for them now. He says, I need help breathing, and then we'll breathe together. And recently, probably about 6 or 8 months ago, something happened, and he was having a really hard time, and he was describing this to me, and he said, I don't know why I do what I do. I just get this feeling in my body, and my brain goes crazy, and I just start acting in these ways, and I don't know why. And he said, because you're so awesome, and I love you so much, and I don't understand why I treat you the way I treat you. And I was like, well, what you're talking about, dude, is something happened, and we don't know what happened to you, but your body remembers. There's this great book called The Body Keeps the Score. I mean, that's what it's about, right? So he's a perfect example of this. And if I was not educated in the way I'm educated, hopefully insightful enough, I would have done what my parents did, which was push me away, ignore me, behave. When you behave, I'll be nice to you. Or I'll spank you, and then you'll do what you're told, right? And that would have made him a million times worse. Because it wasn't about him being a bad kid. It was about him needing attachment, needing regulation, needing support. And it's really hard to give that to someone when they're screaming at you and yelling at you and calling you names. So I had to regulate myself in that spot to get there. So that's a good example. I'll probably use him a lot in this training. But this is the key. What you see isn't always what you get. And in fact, I would say it rarely is what you get. When you're working with a traumatized population, which you all are, what you see is rarely what you think it is. A person who's screaming and yelling and being aggressive at you is actually having a traumatic reaction, right? Someone who is being super overly nice to you and kind of getting in your space and like wanting to like climb in your lap is also having a traumatic reaction, right? So it's really important, and because this is not how our brains work, and it's not how society works, that you find ways to stop yourself and go, I wonder what this is really about. I wonder if this person is feeling unsafe and triggered, and I wonder how I can get them back to a place of regulation so that they can come back into their mind and they can be more present with me. Because it's hard to do that. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you. When someone's screaming and yelling at me, what I usually want to do is scream and yell back at them or run away, because that's my instinct. But we have to train ourselves is, okay, I have to figure out a way to help regulate this situation for them. And sometimes all you can do is regulate yourself in that situation. And that's sometimes the best thing you can do, is just regulate yourself. And then there's this thing in psychology called reciprocal relationship, also a thing called mirror neurons. So we tend to mirror the people who we are with. And so if you can just regulate yourself and take big breaths and slow yourself down, oftentimes that helps them start to slow themselves down and they don't even know they're doing it. So when Ian, my son, is acting the way he does, I take a big breath and I start talking really slowly. And I say, I'm here for you. If you want to climb in my lap, I'll hug you. I'll hold you. You're okay. And I just slowly slow myself down. And that's sometimes all he needs, because then he starts mirroring that behavior. We'll talk more about kind of the tricks and tools of it too. So again, it's this concept that it's not what you see, what you get. So frequent no-shows, disengagement from care, not following treatment plans or care plans or whatever, emotional reactivity, we getting frustrated by what's going on, and then us inadvertently triggering other people. What are some of the things you guys see in your daily work? What are some things like this that you see in your daily work? Just shout it out. How do the people you work with act sometimes? Go ahead.
A lot of the time, like, we see, well, not necessarily here, but just in my work experience, I've seen a lot of no-shows.
Yeah.
A lot of anger, a lot of being withdrawn. Also, like, if they're coming in angry, and if there's, like, a reaction from other people that is, like, rushing to them or angry themselves, then they usually, it escalates.
Yeah.
So whenever I've been able to, stay calm, like you said, with the mirror that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. How else does trauma manifest for you guys?
Screaming at me way out of proportion to what we're actually dealing with.
Yeah.
Way as
Yeah. Yeah, and you can feel it, right? Because you'll say, I don't know, pick up that, can you mind picking up that thing? And it's super big, and you're like, whoa! That's a huge thing that happens for people. Yeah, what else?
Service provider frustration and burnout.
Yeah, service provider frustration and burnout. I hear some really horrible things that people say about clients. I work with a lot of primary care providers, and they say some really awful things about their patients sometimes. And I have to take a step back and say, this is about trauma and trigger. This isn't about them hating humanity, even though it may feel that way. So yeah, I appreciate that. What else?
A lot of my people need to move. Like,
Need to move?
They can't sit down, so standing up or like
Yes.
walking, they're just moving.
Yeah. Yes, so true. People who have trauma histories usually are moving, because you think about how trauma affects your body. It's about fight or flight, right? It's about get out of the way. So if they're feeling triggered, they're oftentimes moving around. They're looking around, because that's how they've been built biologically to manage. Yeah.
I work in immigration, and so we have to explain a lot of things that are really complicated, and frequently we kind of have the opposite of no-show, where people call every day, or they don't listen, and we get frustrated that they haven't heard what we told them, and really they just need to hear it a lot.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. That is another really common thing for people who have trauma histories. And we'll get into this with the neurobiology of trauma, but just a quick little teaser is when people have trauma, they stop working from the frontal lobe part of the brain, which does all the executive functioning, and they work from the brain stem, which is the most primitive part of our brain, which is about reaction. So if we're talking about something really complicated, which takes a lot of this executive functioning, and they are in a triggered state, they're not hearing any of that, right? So then they need to hear it over and over and over again in order for it to sink in. Again, I hear this a lot from primary care providers, is because they'll say, we sat in the room and I told them everything they needed to do for their diabetes, and they said yes, and they looked like they understood, and then they left the room and they didn't do any of it, right? And we oftentimes in my program will sit with them and we'll say, so we were just meeting with the primary care provider, tell me what you heard them say. And they oftentimes say, I didn't hear anything. And then we say, well, you look like you did. And they go, well, yeah, I know how to nod my head and look like I know what's going on, but I don't know what's going on. And that again is a trauma response, right? I can make it look good. Sure, yes, 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 but I don't understand what you're saying, right? Because I'm dysregulated. And that's a neurobiological protective mechanism in people's lives. What else? Did you see somebody else? I would have, oh yeah.
We run a drop-in center, so sometimes when people are reacting to their own trauma, they'll inadvertently traumatize other clients.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a pinball reaction where they're
So true.
all lighting up.
Yeah. When we were in residential, we used to call that the lockdown. So as soon as one started kind of getting triggered in the milieu, we would say lockdown, and all the other kids had to go to their rooms because that's exactly what would happen. Yeah. Oh, someone else had, yeah.
I work with a lot of volunteers, and I've heard from volunteers in the refugee program, they'll say that the clients aren't doing anything. They're not going out and looking for work. They're not, they don't want to practice English, and that disengagement from those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, classic, right? Like, if I'm having a trauma reaction, and you're telling me all these things I need to do, and I don't feel like I have power or control over those things, I'm going to take power and control where I can. Absolutely. That's really normal. Anything else? Great. So those are the things to start thinking about. Those things that you're seeing and experiencing are actually about trauma. And knowing that about your work, start to think about how does that change how you might interact with someone. Or maybe it doesn't, but starting to think about that. Like I'm thinking about if I'm explaining something super complex to somebody, that instead of diving right into the content, I might like say, hey, let's take a couple breaths. Do you feel okay with that? If we just take a couple deep breaths, kind of get in the room a little bit, and then let me talk about the things I need to talk to you about, or what do you want to talk about first? We have a lot of complicated things, you know? Like starting to think about how that might affect your work. And I would imagine, and I would actually put money on it, that you guys probably already do a ton of that already. Whether you know it or not, the beauty of trauma-informed care is you're already probably doing a lot of it. And I'm just going to give you some words and language and some specific skills and context for you, but you're going to go, oh yeah, I do that. I didn't know that's why I did that, but that's what I do when I'm working with somebody. So common triggers, authority figures are a common trigger for folks. Do you think your clientele see you as authority figures?
Yes.
Yeah, right? And oftentimes this will trip some people up because they're like, but I'm not. And it's like, it's not about whether you are or not. It's about how you're perceived. Since I'm the director of the program, I forget how I'm perceived as the director of my department. And so I will do things and then people have a reaction and I think, why? I'm a great guy. Why would they be freaking out? And then people say, because you're like a person in authority. I just did this great talk with one of the programs and I thought it went great. And then I left and the manager came over and she goes, they think they're all being fired. And I was like, oh my God, what? I didn't say anything about that. I thought it was really positive about what we were doing. And you know, and she was able to say, like, when the director comes to the program meeting, that he never comes to the program meeting, right? I'm the trauma-informed care person. I was like, you're right. I have never been to their program meeting. So in my experience, when the director shows up, there's usually bad news. So I'm sure I walked in the room, they all had a triggered reaction, they didn't hear anything I said, I walked out, and they were like, we're all being fired. So, you know, authority figures whether you want it or not. Sensory cues of past events. This is another reason why you don't have to worry about what the history is or what they had, because it could be something they know about, it could be something they don't know about. It can be any kind of sensory cue. It could be something they hear, something they see, something they smell, something they touch. It could be the time of the year. It could be the feeling of the atmosphere outside. That could trigger people. So it's less about wondering what triggered someone or knowing what triggered someone, and it's more about when you see it, you know what it is. Don't spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. Oftentimes this trips people up too. Well, they come in and they are really triggered, and so I think it's maybe the way I'm standing, or the way I'm sitting, or maybe it's the cologne I'm wearing, and they start to try to do that thing, and I'll tell you, it's a quagmire of stuff you'll never get out of. So don't worry about it, because it could be something you don't even know or they don't even know. But oftentimes sensory cues will trigger people. I had a thing where when I came in and I saw the Play-Doh, I immediately felt good because I have a sensory experience with the Play-Doh smell that's a good one. You know, like I think, oh yeah, I remember when I got to play with Play-Doh and I didn't have to worry about all this other stuff, it was so nice. But I might not. I might be someone who has a different experience. What if someone else has a bad experience with Play-Doh, right? So if you are, just get rid of it. Maybe having a bad experience with Play-Doh. Lack of power and control. Again, we're working with folks, you guys are working with folks, certainly the health plan is working with folks, where they feel like they don't have power and control, you know? On the health plan side, we're saying what we will or won't pay for in terms of their care. That's legitimate, and there's reasons for that, but that's a struggle. So people can feel already like they're being triggered. You know, they may view you as being in power and control and they're not, or the city being in control over them, whatever it is, but that power and control, that feeling of lack of power and control can trigger people. I feel that. I feel triggered when I feel like I don't have power and control. I don't know about you guys. Obviously feeling threatened or attacked, and I have feeling is the key there. Feeling threatened or attacked, not being threatened or attacked, but feeling that way. And I can't ever judge how I make people feel sometimes just by showing up. But sometimes people feel threatened and attacked. So an example of this is when I was doing private practice, and I'm an openly gay therapist in this town. People know me as an openly gay therapist in this town. So I have really lovely, well-intentioned parents who want to bring their newly outed gay son to see me, which is just lovely, right? Because the concept is, well, he's gay and you're gay, and so it should all work out. Well, unfortunately, for some young gay men, other gay men make them feel threatened and attacked because we're like the mirror of what they're struggling with. So I'm sitting there in the way that I am, and they're just like, I do not want to be in here, I don't want to look at you, I don't want to talk about it. And so I'd have lots of conversations with parents with saying, I think they're feeling unsafe and scared and attacked. I am just sitting here, but my just being here is not what they need. Maybe someday when they've accepted themselves and who they are, I'll be a good person for them. But refer them to someone who had the knowledge, but maybe didn't present as a gay man, because that's something they were not ready to hear. So that's kind of an example. I mean, you'd think it would be good, but it triggered them, right? Being caught by surprise. Well, I always say I hate surprises, so there's that. But any kind of surprise. Again, in primary care providers, they do this thing where they walk right in the room, you know? And I've spent a lot of time with primary care providers that say, when you knock, that's awesome, and then wait to hear the response before you open the door. Because they think all I gotta do is knock, right? I'm walking in the door. And it startles people, it makes people feel scared, they're already feeling vulnerable. And so thinking through, don't surprise people. I had a client that I worked with who's very, very traumatized. I'm gonna talk about her more. But I usually sit, when I was doing therapy, I usually sit in my chair and we do our therapy thing. And one day she was talking and I thought, oh, I have this worksheet that I'd really love for her to see. And I just got up and I went to get the worksheet and she got super triggered, and it was really intense, and it actually took me a good hour to get her regulated again, all because I just stood up. But for her and her trauma history, that was very surprising, because I never did that in session before, and all of a sudden I just got up. So in the future, I said to her, so sometimes that may happen, what is helpful? Should I ask you? I would love to show you something. Is it okay if I get up? Should I just not get up? And it was great because it allowed me to acknowledge what was going on in the room, but also to give her power. You tell me how you want to do this. So surprises, things that we wouldn't think are surprising, are sometimes surprising. Feelings of vulnerability and rejection. This is something, again, feelings of vulnerability and rejection. When I would close clients, when we'd be like, our work is done, I think you've done everything you need to do, let's close and be done with therapy, people would often have triggered responses to that because they felt like I was rejecting them, right? And that brings up all sorts of things. So feeling rejected. And then just sensory overload. We are all experiencing sensory overload all the time with phones and traffic and cars and lights and all kinds of stuff. And oftentimes when we have sensory overload, our brain kicks into that trauma response because it's like we're taking in a lot more information than we can process, therefore it must be bad, so we need to do something about that. And then any kind of shaming or inadvertent shaming. I think we all do it, we don't mean to do it, certainly, but inadvertently shaming someone, you know, why didn't you make that phone call? Or why didn't you show up when we had an appointment? I'm, in my world, just asking a question, but it can feel like it's shaming, right? So just being kind of conscious of that. So what are some things, you guys start talking about this, but are there other things that you see when you think someone's being triggered? Or reactions? We heard screaming, yelling, other things?
One of the things I've experienced many times is people telling their stories in excruciating detail over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
Using the exact same words.
Yes.
Sometimes even in one meeting.
Yes. That is a very common reaction to trauma, and there's a lot of research actually about it, and what people think is it's people's ability or trying to make sense of what happened, and so they are saying it over and over and over and over and over because their brains are trying to really make sense of it. And in trauma treatment, we actually do a lot of slowing down of that story because it can overload them, right? So we used to think in trauma treatment, again 20 years ago, that was healing. Is we were going to sit here in this room and you're going to tell me every horrible thing that happened to you. And all we did was overload people and traumatize therapists. So now we teach people about regulation. It's about like control, stop and control. So tell me your story. Okay, now let's stop for a second. Let's take a breath. You know, let's breathe, let's regulate, let's feel the ground, let's feel where you're sitting. Okay, do you want to tell me more or do we want to hold off? Because people are just trying to get it out of them. You think about trauma, it's like trying to get it out of you, right? So I'm just going to say it and talk about it, say it, talk about it. Maybe it will go away, or maybe I'll make sense of it. Really common reaction. That's great. Thanks for saying that. What else? Other things that you see?
I talk about people's anger, but I think it happens in trauma. The expression is like they rhino or they hedgehog.
Oh,
either
yeah.
They get really explosive and really out, or they totally just close it on themselves.
Yes.
And everything just shut out around.
Yeah, rhino or hedgehog, that's brilliant. Yes. That fight-flight response. Absolutely. Anger. Yeah.
So we obviously don't perceive as a catastrophic thinking in the sense that they might have a response to like, so you could bother me sort of way, and taking it very personally and not seeing the empathetic response of maybe that person just wanted to, did this, but did something by accident versus
Yes.
did it to hurt them.
Yeah.
And that can be often misread.
Absolutely. That happens so much. When I worked in the homeless program, the kids used to always say to me, "You only care about me because you get paid." And I would say, "I don't get paid that much, so that's not why I'm doing it." But that's that reaction, right? Like, you can't be that you really care, or that you really want to help, right? And then we have to deal with that, because it's, I know I'm really here because I care. I believe in the mission. I believe in humanity in that way. Yeah, what else? Anything else? The snacks are being delivered. All right, it can look like crying. We're gonna take a break here in about 5 minutes. It can be crying, that boundary pushing, right? Fear, just people being afraid of stuff that shouldn't normally be afraid. Things that, like the surprising sounds and stuff. You're like, wow, why is that? I don't understand. Yelling, being overly friendly. I don't know if you've seen this before, but people who really are super overly friendly. I was just at ironically, a trauma-informed care training that I was taking as a participant. It was about organizational resilience and trauma. And this woman came and she sat next to me, and she was very overly friendly. And like, we were best friends. And you know, my immediate reaction was, "You have a trauma history. Like, I can totally feel this right now." And then later on in the class, she was talking about how she had this trauma history, and like, then told all her story about all the people she dated and how they felt like she was clingy. And I was like, I totally get that. I'm not giving you my phone number to hang out, but I understand. Overeating. I did a trauma-informed care training for a group of diabetic educators, and talk about assumptions. I went in and I thought, okay, they deal with trauma every day. Of course they know this. What am I going to teach them, right? It was so the opposite. They had no concept of how trauma related to overeating and diabetes and all of that. It was so fascinating to me. And this woman was telling this story about this woman she was working with, and they did all this planning and all this stuff, and then she would just leave their sessions and binge eat, and then she was like, I don't understand, because she seemed so on board. And I would say, like, I wonder what that's about in terms of her trauma. And she goes, what are you talking about? It's about eating. And I was like, yes, and eating is about self-soothing, and eating is about, like, changing your biochemical to make you feel better. And then she said, well, she did talk about how her mom would, like, restrict her eating when she was a kid and yell at her when she ate too much. And she goes, I wonder if I'm like her mom. And I was like, I wonder, because you're talking with her about food and what you shouldn't eat and in this kind of sterile environment, and then she goes and she binges, right? So I just always thought that was interesting. Never make assumptions about what we think people know. Anger, we talked about. Avoidance. I just don't show up. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. I do a lot of avoidance when I'm triggered. Just so you know. If you trigger me, I'm just going to leave. No, I'm just kidding. Manipulation, what we call manipulation, I just call it trauma response. Lying. And it never is helpful to try to convince people that they're lying, because that usually makes them feel more triggered. So if you say, I know you're lying to me, that doesn't usually work. They don't usually say, oh yeah, you're right, I'm totally lying. Great, you caught me. No, usually they just double down. Kind of like someone that we know. No-shows. People just don't show up, right? That's avoidance too. People just don't want to be there. So, actually, let's take a quick break so you can get some snacks, and then we'll talk about the trauma cycle. Isn't that exciting? You guys quieted down nice. That's good. I was trying to think, because I worked with preschoolers, so I know how to control the room with preschoolers. And then I taught for a number of years at Portland State and Lewis and Clark with freshmen and sophomores, which is a little bit trickier, but I can pull them together too. I usually got to show them like a video or something, and then they zone in on the video. Preschoolers, you just have lots of tricks and things. Preschool's the best, by the way. If anyone's ever worked with preschoolers, they're the best. Oh my gosh. So open to the world and excited about everything. I remember one time I was working with preschoolers and it was recess and I was monitoring recess. And then, the bell rings and you gotta be the bad guy that makes them all come in from recess. And I remember there was this one little girl and it was fall and she was over by this spot and everyone else had gone in and I went over to her, I think her name was Mia, and I said, Mia, what are you doing? It's time to be inside. And she goes, I was just sitting here. It's such a beautiful day. And a leaf fell from the tree and I just had to watch it go all the way to the ground. And I was like, well, you got me there. You're right. So she and I watched another leaf fall, and then I went and told the teacher it was not her fault, it's my fault. Which when you're the counselor at the school, you get away with a lot of that stuff. Because they're like, okay, it must have been serious. Yeah, we were being really present and watching leaves fall. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the trauma cycle. This comes out of Covington's work, which I think it is helpful for context, and I won't spend a whole bunch of time because we only have an hour and 20 minutes or so. But to think about that idea of trauma as a cycle, because it is a cycle, when someone has a traumatic event, it oftentimes predisposes them to more vulnerability and more trauma, because people who have trauma act in ways that put them in situations that sometimes make them become re-traumatized. So it really starting with this kind of traumatic event, and then I'm going to talk about the healthcare system, but you can put in any system in there about how it interacts in this trauma cycle. So you have this trauma event that happens, remember it could be anything, big T or little t, and it overwhelms the person's ability to cope. Remember, if you have a lot of coping skills, then you probably maybe can weather more trauma than someone else, who knows. And then you do this thing called maladaptive coping. Once your coping skills are taxed, your body and mind are brilliant, and it figures out a way to get you through, because we're built for survival. So it starts doing maladaptive coping, and that could be the yelling, the screaming, the manipulation, the avoiding. It could be all sorts of things for people. And then the system responds, the system, whatever that system is, social services, healthcare, families are systems. They respond to that coping skill, which sometimes and oftentimes will further entrench those responses. So like I was saying with my son as a perfect example, if I had responded negatively to his maladaptive coping, I could have re-traumatized him in the process. And in fact, I probably did. We all inadvertently traumatize our children. So I know in 20 years he'll be in therapy that I'm probably paying for where he's saying that I traumatized him. That's just how it works. But, now he's unconscious and try to be intentional about what I'm doing. But really, the system, this is the opportunity, right? The system can respond in a different way that helps people not become entrenched in their responses. So the example that I have used with Ian is a good one, in that by breaking the cycle with him, by helping him regulate and helping him calm, and helping him come back into the executive functioning part of his brain, I've now helped him practice a different way of doing it. And he and I just had a conversation this week about it, where he was beating himself up about he'd had some run-in with a kid, and he said, I just don't know why I do those things, and why I say those things, and it's so hard, I'm never gonna get better. And then I said to him, I said, you have to remember, you're a million times better than you used to be. Like, you have put in the time and the effort and the work. You still have more work to do, we all have work to do, but you are so much better. And where we used to have temper tantrums and violence that happened for 8 hours, he was a kid who would be violent for 8 hours in a day, now lasts 5 minutes, maybe, right? And it's not even violent anymore. And so we broke the cycle of that. But you think about kids in foster care or kids that are in abusive homes or things of that nature, right? It can entrench the response. The kid does something maladaptive, the parent responds to that by smacking them, hitting them, yelling more at them, and entrenches that response more. So it's all about breaking that cycle. And for those of us who work with traumatized folks, it's our opportunity to maybe break that cycle for them. Or maybe just a moment we can break that cycle for them. And then also our own triggers come in here. We are not immune to being triggered in maladaptive coping. When we encounter it from others, oftentimes triggers our own response. I grew up with, my brother got together with this very, very traumatized person, and she is who we would call, she has borderline personality disorder, and which is really just trauma, just so everybody knows. But that's not a billable code, so you gotta call it something else. And she wreaked havoc on my family they just got divorced like 4 years ago maybe. So she has wreaked havoc on our family forever. Every holiday she managed to destroy she was that person, right? She was the rhino. She'd come in and destroy everything. And so I, in turn, did a trauma response where I thought early in my career, all I wanted to do was work with borderlines, because I was like, my trauma mastery. If I can work with borderlines and I can heal all the borderlines of the universe, then I can heal my own trauma. I didn't know that at the time, in the beginning of my career, I just did DBT groups, which is a treatment for borderline personality people. So it's a group of 10 borderlines in a room, and you're teaching them regulation skills. And it took me, I don't know long, maybe a year and a half, but I thought, I don't know that I'm the right person for this, because they trigger the heck out of me. Like, everything they do, I get really triggered, and that was because of my sister-in-law. And I actually had a really great professor in grad school who said to me, I wrote a paper once about my family, and she gave it back to me, and in the margin it said, which is not okay. So I just want you guys to know, I'm not saying what she said was okay, but the point was well taken. She said, I used to think that you were super defensive because you're gay. What I realize is it's because of your crazy family. And I was like, how dare you? But then I was like, no, it's kind of true. And that's something I've had to learn to do. So when I encounter a person who is borderline, I don't handle it well. And I have to do a lot of work to keep my own triggers under control. And so I'm going to give you an example of the borderline person that I worked with who had this cycle. To be fair, I never worked with borderlines in my practice because of my own internal struggle and triggers. And she snuck under the radar because she came to me and she said, I'm just depressed, and I was like, great with depression, I'm good with mood disorders, let's get going. It wasn't until about 3 months in that she really revealed all the trauma history that she had had. And once she revealed all that trauma history, she started to react like a traumatized person and became very unhinged in our work. She was a person who would just tell the story over and over and over and over and over again, and I couldn't get her to stop. And at that point, when you're in treatment with someone, you can try to refer, right? Because I'm not the best person for you. But by then you built a relationship, and I had to do the dance of, am I going to do more damage by saying to her, you're too much for me? Or can I grow and she grow and we learn together? And we did some really awesome work together, but her story was that she had, post that kid I worked with in residential, she had the worst childhood trauma that I'd ever heard. Just horrific. And of course that overwhelms your coping skills because you're too young to understand what's happening to you. And she was abused from birth until probably she left the house at 17 or 18. And so her maladaptive was a lot of social manipulation. She's very savvy, so she knew how to get people to do the things she wanted them to do. And when that didn't work, she would resort to a lot of yelling and screaming and threatening. And she also abused a lot of drugs and alcohol to kind of try to cope. And previous to me, she had a therapist that I'm sure she triggered. And in his office, there was a little plant, is what she would tell me. And in his office, she got really mad and she pushed the plant over and it broke. And he fired her. And he was like, I can't work with you anymore, I'm not gonna work with you anymore. And so she, right, entrenched response, I can't trust anyone. I can't even trust the person that I'm paying for therapy. And so she had and then she's re-traumatized. So she came to me not only with all this childhood trauma, but also being traumatized by a person who was supposed to help her. And I don't blame him. I mean, she was very, very, very challenging. But I also had to work with that. So my responses were really calculated to try to help regulate her. She's the one that when I got up out of my chair to get the paper, that she had a reaction. One time I leaned forward to try to understand what she was saying, and she really got triggered when I leaned forward. We did lots of things like when the session was over, I would stay in my chair and she would get up and walk into the hallway because if I got torn off. So the ACEs study is the Adverse Childhood Effects Study. I always say effects. Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And this was a huge study that really revolutionized the concept of trauma. And what it did is it said that folks who had trauma histories were more likely to experience chronic diseases. The first study was really around obesity, but COPD, cardiovascular disease, substance abuse, depression, homelessness, it really showed that people who had trauma histories were more likely to have these kind of things happen to them. And why it revolutionized, for a lot of people were like, well, yeah, the social implications make sense, but for a lot of people, the medical part was very interesting. And that's because when a person is traumatized and in a toxic stress situation in their body, your body's constantly flooding you with all sorts of chemicals that are not meant to be in your body all the time. And so that puts extra pressure on your heart, it raises your blood pressure, it does all these things, puts pressure on your kidneys. And so you end up actually getting more chronic illnesses because of a traumatic response. And that was kind of changed the game because all of a sudden it became like a hard science, not just stuff we talk about. But wow, there's actual physical ramifications to trauma and toxic stress. And that was a huge turning point, I think, in terms of the work and the data and people saying, we really need to think this through. So, I don't think this is gonna work. So does anyone know Nadine Burke-Harris? She's amazing. So Nadine Burke-Harris is a doctor, and she is kind of like my guru. I love her so much. And so she has this beautiful TED Talk that she does around ACEs and trauma, and I think it's just a really nice introduction to the idea of ACEs. And so we're going to watch that. And she actually just came out with a book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm very excited to read it. And it's again, she's kind of like revolutionized this idea of trauma and ACEs. So I met Nadine just last year. I was at a trauma-informed care. That was like strobe light for a minute. I got really excited. Boom, 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 boom. I met her at a trauma-informed care learning collaborative in San Francisco, and I was like, okay, I can't wait to meet her. I'm gonna meet her, I'm so excited. And I get to the learning collaborative, and I'm looking around, and she's not there, and I thought, oh, she's not coming. It's a bummer. Like, I should be there learning, right, or sharing, and I'm just like geeking out about meeting Nadine. And then about I don't know, 45 minutes into the learning collaborative, she just walks right in, and we're all like, she sits down, she says like amazing, brilliant things that you just blow your mind, and then it's lunchtime, and she's in the lunch line, and she's like right here, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna introduce myself, I'm gonna say you've inspired me to do this work, and I said, oh, you're gonna have a ham sandwich? And she said, yeah, and I was like, oh, good choice, and I walked away. So that was my experience meeting Nadine vicarious, because I'm a big dork. But she is really brilliant. She's actually coming, I think, to Portland to do a book reading, so you might want to keep it somewhere in the ether to go see her, because she's really a brilliant speaker, a brilliant person, really trying to lead this charge that says, we have this information, why don't we do more with it? I don't get it. As pediatricians, why aren't we screening for ACEs all the time? And it's really this, you can't talk about ACEs without talking about this pyramid, because this is like, I don't know, law, I think. But it's this concept that just shows that, adverse childhood experiences and how it leads to early death. I mean, it really does truly affect people's health, and actually they die much sooner than people who haven't had trauma histories. So it's a really big deal and an epidemic in this world. Elizabeth came and got me a break, and she was talking about also, in addition to all of this, like thinking about systemic racism and as a white person with privilege, how I experience the world different than other people, and you have to be at least thoughtful about that, because even if we all have adverse childhood experiences, when I walk into a room with my trauma and I see a sea of other white faces, I have a different experience than someone who's a person of color walking into that space. And how that affects your trauma response and how does the environment affect you is really important. I feel very similar when I walk into a room with white straight men. I feel very intimidated by that. And they sometimes react to me weirdly because I'm a gay man and they gotta do weird stuff to make themselves feel better. I don't know. And so when I walk into a room and all I see is a bunch of presumably white straight men in my world, I get a little nervous. I feel much more comfortable around women in an environment like that. So it's just about knowing how that all affects you, owning your privilege, language. We live in a world where, people assume you speak English, and if you don't, that's stuff that you're bringing to the table. And so knowing how that affects people is a really important part of this. So she talked about this, the 3 types of ACEs: abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction. I actually have a copy of the ACE survey if you guys want it, just so you can see what are the actual questions. But as she is saying, there are 10 questions, and if you positively answer to 1, that's considered 1 ACE. So you can have up to 10 ACEs. And in just knowing kind of your trauma history sometimes is helpful, because you're like, wow, I had no idea I had 5 ACEs. How does that affect me? How does that, do something? And just knowing that about yourself is oftentimes helpful to know the trajectory. So she talked a lot about this, but the scores, right? So a score of 4 or more, you're twice as likely to smoke, 12 times as likely to have attempted suicide, twice as likely to have problems with alcohol, 10 times as likely to have injected drugs. So again, there's a direct impact in how you experience an adverse childhood experience, how that leads to your adulthood. It has a direct impact on your health. This is information that comes out of HealthShare, who is the CCO here in the Metro. And they looked at high utilizers, so people who are utilizing the inpatient services and the ED a lot. And what they found is that high utilizers, were 88% of them had experienced childhood neglect, as compared to 40% of non-high utilizers, right? So again, you think about there's major impacts to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. 41% had a parent or family member with a substance use disorder, and 13% of non-high utilizers did. 40% had unmet basic needs, non-high utilizers 0. So, it has impact. And because I work in a place where we are thinking about ED rates and inpatient rates, this stuff comes up a lot because I say you will not curb ED utilization, inappropriate ED utilization, if you're not addressing trauma. I remember one time we had a client and she went to the ED every single night. And in the ED, you go in and they go in, she says, I'm having chest pain. Well, you're gonna get worked up for chest pain. So it wasn't that anyone's gonna turn her away. And one of the HRSs, I remember, said, I couldn't get her to not go. I didn't know what was happening, because they do the workup and nothing was wrong. And so she met with her one day and she said, I'm just really curious, like, tell me what happened to you. Like, what happened to you? Not why you do what you do, but what happened to you? And the woman kind of looked at her and she said, well, I don't really know what you mean. She goes, well, what I know is when people go to the ED a lot, something happened to them to get them to that place. So there's no judgment, right? It's not like you're bad, you should stop going to the ED. And the woman happened, because she had a relationship with this person, she opened up and said, well, you may not know this, but I live out of my car. I actually live in my car. And at night, I get really, really scared because I was raped. And so what I do is I go to a place that's lit, and that's the ED, that's open 24/7. And I basically feel safe being in a well-lit place where I'm not gonna be hurt. And so we were like, wow, this isn't about ED use, this isn't about all this other stuff, this is about home, having a safe place, being in a place where you can be safe. That's what this is about. So the treatment plan stopped being about stopping her from going to the ED. We were like, go to the ED all you want. Instead, we were saying, okay, we want to get you housed. Where do you want to be housed? First question. Not everybody wants to be housed, mind you. Do you want to be housed? What would that look like? How can we help you do that? What is important for you to be housed? Is there a part of town where you feel more safe? There was lots of that conversation. And I'll tell you, we eventually got her housed and her ED utilization stopped, of course. She doesn't need it anymore, right? People are very adaptive. They're gonna get their needs met one way or another. So we'll skip that. There's lots of trauma-informed care interventions. Lots of, there's the atrium model, the essence being, there's risk connection, there's sanctuary model. Some of these you may have heard. People adopt, oftentimes, they go through a process of becoming a trauma-informed organization. It's a big, long process. It's really cool if you have the money, resources, time, and stamina to do that. And a lot of people will adapt or adopt these kind of known trauma-specific interventions. But what I always say is you don't need to adopt one of these in order to be trauma-informed, right? You can learn, you can grow, you can continue to get more education around it. You can adapt your principles, practices to be that. You don't need to become like a sanctuary model person. But it's important for people to know. So I want to quickly talk about something positive, right? I'm talking about a lot of negative stuff. Is this concept of resiliency. So what I really want to make sure people understand in this process is when we're talking about trauma, I actually find people who have trauma histories to be the most resilient people that I know, and that's because they've been through such hardship and they've come out the other side. Now, it may be maladaptive, it may be things that aren't really benefiting them anymore, but that doesn't mean they're not resilient. In fact, they are where they're at because of probably a lot of those protective factors. So a little bit about resilience. This comes out of Cornell, but I really like the idea of it, which is, they talk about student resilience, but it's the same concept, is that in the blue area, I have to read it because it's a lot of detail. In the blue area are skills that support resilience. So social engagement, self-awareness, attention focus, meaning. And then in the orange, the pathways through which students can develop and strengthen their resilience, or as I would say, people. Because the concept is the same. So when you think about how to build resilience for people or help people be resilient, it's really important to know that there are fundamental pieces. One is the social engagement. That can help people be resilient by having social engagement. in your housing communities that you guys have here, that I'm sure is a factor of helping them be resilient if they have a community within that housing complex. That is important for people. You can connect people to other people. We used to have a program, unfortunately we lost the funding, but we used to have a program called Give to Get. And in Care Oregon, it was really about connecting people who had loneliness together. You know, you're lonely and you're lonely and you both have skills in different areas. How about we get you together and you can use those skills with each other? And it was great, but you know, of course, you lose funding and you can't support it anymore. But the idea of social engagement is really important. And because that leads to opportunities for connectedness to others. If I'm feeling triggered, if I'm having a hard time, if I'm connected to someone who can talk me through it, who can help me regulate, who care about me, I'm going to get through that. I'm going to bounce back. And then that helps us get to self-awareness and self-care. If I have an understanding about how my trauma affects me, if I have an understanding about how to be resilient, in that reflection with my friend, then that helps me and leads me to other opportunities of self-reflection. How can I move from this? Wow, every time I go in that doctor's office, I get really freaked out. Every time I walk into the TriMet, bus, I have a panic attack. You start to think through, like, what is it about that? Which leads to attention and focus. Okay, so if I go into the TriMet bus, these are the things that happen to me. I wonder what it is. Oh, I think it's related to X, Y, and Z. Okay, so next time I'm gonna breathe, I'm gonna regulate myself, and I'm gonna try to get on that bus. Or I'm gonna bring my friend and say, can you just talk to me while I'm sitting on this bus so that I can get through it? And then you start to have self-mastery, right? You start to be able to say, like, I did that. Like, I rode that bus. I was just on a flight to Medford. We have an office in Medford with another director, and I didn't know she was freaked out about being in planes. And so we're starting to take off, and she's like, breathing, and I was like, are you okay? And she's like, just talk a lot. Everyone who flies with me, if they talk a lot, I'll be okay. I was like, okay, wow, this is a really weird flight. I hope we give us coffee. I don't really know what we're gonna, And then she's like, I just have to get to a certain altitude and then I'll be fine. And we got to that, and it was her mastery, right? She is an executive director at Care Oregon. She has to travel a lot. So she's like, I gotta learn how to do this. And so that was her skill, right? And she said, I don't travel alone. I always make someone go with me. And she goes, or if I happen to be alone, I make really quick friends with that person in the seat next to me. Because I will have a panic attack on this flight, right? So she's kind of learned how to have mastery over that. And then in that process, you develop meaning. What is this really about? What does this mean to me? What does this mean about me being a resilient person or a traumatized person? Right? How can I take all the bad stuff that happened to me and realize that something else came out the other side, right? That came out the other side. And then that gives you opportunities for service. Resiliency is all about giving back to other people. That's why we have that concept I was talking about, trauma mastery. Because if I can give back to others, if I can help, if I can be in service to others, then I can feel good and better about the stuff that I went through, which makes me feel more like a resilient person. And then we can have the cycle go all over again for people that we're helping and we're experiencing, right? So I think it's always important to talk about resiliency in this process because it is all about resiliency and helping people through. And resiliency is the pathway forward. You have folks who are fleeing war, right? They're resilient. My goodness, they're resilient, right? Helping point out how they're resilient is key, right? Wow, you really are good at this. Taco always talks to me about the hustle. Like, she's always like, it's the hustle. Don't take it personal. It's the hustle, right? They're just trying to get the needs met. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. You're right. It is the hustle, and that's good on them, right? That's great, And so it's about pointing out how people are resilient. That really help people along. I had a kid once I worked with, and he was really struggling and having a hard time, and he would say, like, I don't know how to do this, it's really hard. And I said, but what you do is you don't give up. You keep trying, no matter how hard it is. And that's called perseverance. And perseverance is a resiliency trait. You just keep plugging away. Even if it doesn't work, you keep trying. That is resiliency. And people who are trying hard and trying hard and trying hard don't always realize that it's resiliency, but it is, right? I'm notorious for making jokes when I'm uncomfortable or when I'm being like, having a hard time. And that's because humor is a big resiliency trait for me. That's how I bounce back. That's how I get through things, is I use humor to get me through. Some people have this brilliant life skills. They're just really good at problem solving. They're just really good at keeping the list and checking that list off. That's resiliency, right? We don't always call it that, but that's what it is. People have skills. So I always find it important to tell people what those skills are because we kind of forget for ourselves. All right, so we're going to move to an activity for the last little bit because this will be helpful and get you guys thinking a little bit. So these are the core principles of trauma-informed care. Safety is a core principle. So that is both physical and emotional. Trustworthiness is a core principle. You trusting in me trusting in you, me trusting in the process, me trusting in the world and the universe, whatever it is. Trustworthiness is key. Choice. When someone is being triggered or feeling triggered or having a hard time, giving them a choice, no matter how small or big, is really important for helping them feel regulated. Collaboration. We're in this together. How can we do this work together? How can we get on that bus that you're having a hard time with? How can we fill out this form that neither one of us really understands? Right? And empowering people, giving them back the power to do what they need to do. That is really powerful for someone to say, wow, okay, I do have agency here. I can do something different. That helps people be regulated. That helps them get back in their thinking part of their mind, right? So what I like to do with this is because the core principles are awesome. Oh, hello. The core principles are awesome, but they're intangible a little bit. And so what I've seen with people is they're like, okay, that's cool, but what do I do with that? So what I want you to do is on your table, you have a big white piece of paper there and some markers. And I want you guys to, just start, pick one as a group, like say, oh, well, we're gonna pick safety. And I want you to brainstorm with your table. How do we, when we're working with our clients, how do we concretely promote safety? So an example might be that I make sure that this is a stupid one, but I'm out of ideas. That we leave that door is open. Actually, that's a good one. We leave that door open, right? We could close that door so we have privacy, but we leave that door open because we are conveying safety. You can leave this room if you need to leave, right? I can convey emotional safety by how I speak to someone. I can regulate my voice, I can talk softly, I can, if I know how they like to receive nonverbal communication, maybe I know they don't like to be looked at, so I don't look at them. Maybe they like to be looked at, so I look at them, right? How do you promote safety? So just pick whichever one you want. You don't have to pick safety, trustworthy, choice. But start to write out concretely on this big white paper, what do you do that promotes that, right? What do you do? How do you convey collaboration to your clients? How do you convey choice? And just start to have a conversation. We'll do that for just about 10 minutes or so. Then we'll get back. Go for it. So I'm going to have you guys report out a little bit. So if you have somebody at your table that feels comfortable reading out which one you chose, and then what were some of the concrete things. I love when I say that, because then the tables are like... And then you have people like me who are like, I'll totally do it. And just give us a couple, you don't have to read the whole thing, but just give us a couple ideas. What was the thing you chose, and then what are the concrete things that you do? Because again, my goal when I do these is I want you to have something to take back, something you can hold on to. Because again, some of this is really high level, and you're like, okay, but I don't really, what am I going to do with it? It sounds great, what do I do with it? So my goal is that you get some ideas about how to, when you leave this room, demonstrate, right, trustworthiness with the people people you work with. The other thing that I'll do is, I told Jill this, is I'll take all of these and I'll transcribe it and then I'll email it to her and she can send it to you so you have everybody's examples. So you have all that. And then I can also share slides too if you guys want that. So is there anybody want to share out quickly? Any other Aries in the room? Not Aries. I know Aries. Do you want the microphone or no? All right. What did you pick and what are some ideas?
So we picked trustworthy, and some of them that we came up with were listening, following through, being available for the person, being honest, genuine, establishing confidentiality.
Great. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I always love that with trustworthiness. I love the authentic and being genuine, so when you mess up, you own that. It's so powerful for people with trauma histories when you're like, yeah, I don't know what I just did, sorry, that was a big mess. Because it means, oh, you're human and you know when you're not doing something right, The thing with traumatized folks, all of us, really, because we all have it, but the thing with traumatized folks is they can smell BS from a mile away. And so the second you walk in and they're like, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about. Tammy, the client that I was talking about earlier, where I really misstepped with her was she was telling me originally all the trauma, and I have to say, in all the years that I've heard trauma, I was shocked. And I have a real good poker face, so I know I didn't look shocked, but I was a little taken aback. And she goes, I'm scaring you right now, aren't I? And you know what my response was? No, it's fine. No, totally great. And we took 3 more sessions to repair that comment. Because she was like, you were full of it. Because I know I was freaking out. So finally, by the second session of the repair, I said, I just want to own that. You were right. You were telling me a lot of stuff at once, and I was shocked, and I wasn't scared, but I was definitely thinking in my head how I was going to help you, and I was a little freaked out. And that helped a lot, because she's like, okay, at least you could be honest, because I could tell that you were freaked out. So yeah, those key to being trustworthy and following through, super important. And if you don't follow through, then you own that. Nothing irritates me more than when I email somebody, I know they got that email, and then I call them, they're like, oh, I didn't get your email. And I'm like, you didn't? Oh, it must have went in my junk folder. Like, you were lying. Just say you didn't read it. All right, who's next? Yeah.
Since you started with trustworthy, we're going to follow up on that, which was trustworthy as well.
Great.
And in addition to what you said, which we have as well, we talked about the clarity of healthy boundaries. We talked about really checking in with people. We talked about the importance of body language and how that makes people feel, sitting next to them instead of opposite in some cases. We talked about cultural competency and the respect that conveys. Probably enough.
That's great. Very nice. Close. Yeah.
For us, because we run a drop-in, we talk about a combination of collaboration and empowerment. And the way we do that in drop-in is we have a community agreement that was created by the community. We hold community building meetings that everyone comes together in the community, and that will, we hope, or that it addresses power, so that we're sharing power with our community, that they're involved in decision-making process. If things come up, it's something that we're working on together. And then in our one-on-one meetings, having client-led meetings, starting off with how do you want to spend our next hour together, and then working on that. So being really client-centered and client-focused in that way too. So it's a combination of the two.
That's great. Yeah, giving people those kind of choices really help. Give them power. How do you want to spend the next hour? It's great. Or sometimes if you have things you gotta do, being able to say, so I have these 2 things we gotta talk about. Do you want to talk talk about. That's great. Yeah.
We talked about kind of like a combination of safety and trustworthiness. So like emotional safety being like I do a lot of media work, and bringing a camera into something is immediately invasive, especially when you're like trying to be sensitive to someone's story or situation or whatever's happening. So just creating like a sort of an instant rapport, knowing how to control your body language and also your vocal tone, and just being present and actively listening, and like creating a kind of safe space where like you're not going to push, you're not going to invade anything that might be an emotional boundary or touchy or triggering, but you're available and you're present, and you're there to work with whatever they need or they feel comfortable with, and just kind of reassuring them that similar to what they said, being reliable and available, and like just showing up, you know, and saying I'm here and I'm available and I'm like here for you, and I'm not trying to get anything out of it. You know what I mean? Like you're like I'm a friend. So
That's great. I didn't think about the media equipment, but you're totally right. Like, right, puts people immediately on edge.
yeah, how do you feel with this?
I love it. I mean, I'm an Aries, and that's what we do. I'll resist to not sing. I like to sing. I'm a karaoke person, so I'll really try not to do that. Are you?
Yes, of course I am. Come on.
You,
I wear kindred spirits.
that's awesome.
Can we end with you both singing?
Oh my God.
With the song.
A little like Happy Babe. I can do Happy Babe. Who else? Those are great. Yeah.
We were talking specifically about refugees over here. They all somehow interconnect, but the most important one that we feel is empowerment. When someone is fleeing another country, they come into this country and trying to start a new life, and our job over here is to empower them to become who they want to be.
Yeah.
That's, letting them be responsible, giving them their dignity back, by giving them some certain type of tasks, which is, because we learn how to ride a bus. And, and then when they succeed, and then they're able to teach another newly arriving refugee, and then that just gives them some sort of empowerment. What they're doing.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about in the health resilience program, something similar, because it's called health resilience, right? We're trying to teach resilience, and that's that thing of if you can help build the skill for someone to take back the power for themselves, that's the ticket, because then they can share that. They can, when you can take the bus by yourself, it seems small, but when you're new in this country and you don't understand everything that's going on, that's a big deal, And so it is about helping people find those ways to have power and feel empowered in their life. I think that's brilliant. That's so good. Yeah.
We did a combination of choice and empowerment. So, in the legal context, we talk about explaining the options and making sure that they understand what the options are in their case, and that we aren't going to make any decisions without them or submit anything without their permission or share their information without permission, just to make sure that they know that they're driving the bus. They know they're in charge of the representation. But then also in development context, working with clients, making sure they understand the full scope of the decisions that they're making. Like if we make a video about you, it's out there. It's not just for this thing; it's going to be out there. But making sure they understand the scope so that they can really make informed decisions. And then we talked about how it's also empowering for them to share their story or share their journey and help Catholic charities. Like they've gotten help from Catholic charities to feel like they have the skills and the power to help us in return. It's also empowering them.
So that's it. Yeah, and being able to give back is also a resiliency trait, right? That in service, when I can be in service, it helps me in my own resilience, right? Is that I'm giving back to others, that helps. So that's great, it's a great example. Who else? Yeah?
So we didn't get anything written down because we were bouncing around between all of them because they are so interconnected. But one thing I thought was interesting in response to what Sarah said about giving choice in the legal context is oftentimes with my clients, actually very triggering to present options with risk levels, particularly in the current political climate where I don't necessarily understand the risk levels. So choices trigger to some extent when I'm supposed to be guiding them, and then that kind of also goes into like trustworthiness, people trusting me to know what I'm talking about, but also to give them choice, and then collaboration, trusting me to tell them what they need to contribute to the process, because particularly with the caseload that we have at a nonprofit, we need their collaboration. We need them to secure the documents to submit to immigration.
So I just want to field any questions, anything that you've been thinking about today. We didn't get to neurobiology. I apologize, but I still field questions if you have any burning ones. Yeah.
So what do you suggest for someone who's not a counselor, trained at all in counseling, when someone shares things with you that would be, that you're just not equipped to respond to? Do you think I don't know what to say, I hear you, I don't want to set off the BS meter.
Yeah, right.
I with that a lot.
Right. That must be really hard.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
With that one.
You know, and I think in that regard, it is about being as authentic as you can be. You know, so just tapping into, wow, that is really intense, or that makes me feel overwhelmed. So I bet that was really overwhelming for you. You know, I don't know how to help you with that. You know, you're telling yourself, I don't know how to help you with that. Would you like me to put you in contact with someone who can help you with that? You know, that I'm an attorney, not a counselor, so I don't really know how to help you. What do you need right now? You know, those kind of things, just as genuine as possible. Because what happens oftentimes when people share things to us that we're not prepared to manage or we've been trained to manage, right, is we get kind of overwhelmed. And then we either freeze, don't say anything, or we try to make it okay, or we do lots of different things. And what is helpful is to first regulate yourself, and then just be as authentic as you can be, because that's really what they're looking for, you know? And they'll be able to tell if you're saying something that doesn't feel genuine. People have said things to me and I just go, whoa, that's intense, you know? And as a therapist response, it's not the best, right? but for people with trauma, they go, yeah, it sucks. And I'm like, yeah, it sounds like it sucks. I wouldn't even know what to do with that, you know? And sometimes it's all you have to do. Sometimes just reflecting back to, like people say, you know, I got yelled at on the bus and I'm just so angry right now. And I was like, yeah, I bet you're angry. I hate my yelled at too, you know? Just trying to be authentic as possible. And then regulating yourself is really key. So if you notice, like, ooh, I'm really tense, trying to breathe. Also, you can always just encourage regulation for them. So, you know, if they tell you something really intense and they're really upset, being able to just say, wow, do you want to just step outside for a second? Do you want to take a big breath? I find that is helpful to me. Or I'm feeling kind of intense right now. I'm going to take a breath. Sometimes people don't need anything from us other than just to receive the story. So I'd say some of that. Yeah, the big thing is if you're freaked out, just say, wow, I'm freaked out. I don't know what to say to that. It's okay. People get it. They would rather have that. Yeah?
What do you suggest for regulation techniques for creating a safe environment and not talk to clients over the phone about things that can be your fault?
Yeah, over the phone is good stuff. So the best thing you can do when you're on the phone is regulate your tone and regulate your pace. So we do a lot of telephonic work in my department, so we oftentimes get people who are very dysregulated on the phone. And so we always talk about slowing it way down. And for those of us who are not dysregulated, it sounds really annoying. But for someone who's on the other phone, they're not picking up on that, right? So I hear this a lot with our behavioral health people on the phone, and they'll be like, wow, Sherry, that's really intense. Wow, it sounds like you're having a hard time. I wonder what I can do for you right now. really slowing your voice down intentionally is really helpful. Because again, you don't have to be in face-to-face with someone to mirror neurons, although there is debate about that. But I think I've seen it on the phone, and people will start to regulate on the phone. I also sometimes will say, if they're not completely dysregulated, is sometimes being able to say, it sounds like you're really upset right now. Do you want to take a couple deep breaths on the phone? I'm happy to do that with you. And just breathe together on the phone. That's sometimes good. I usually ask people where they are. And where are you at right now? Are you in your house? Oh, okay. Are you sitting on your couch? Oh, okay. What else is in your house right now? Your kids there, trying to distract them from the other things that, they're trying to talk about. Because pulling people out of their experience. Oh yeah, kids are screaming. Yeah, I hear that. What are they doing? Oh, they're playing with their new toy. Oh, they got a new toy? What did they get? And you're distracting them from the things. Sometimes helps too. It is a little more difficult on the phone because you can't see them and you can't experience their feeling. We have this connection of empathy when we're with someone, and sometimes you can't feel that. But we've done a lot of that. But I would say, if nothing else, just slow down the voice is really powerful. Yeah, what else? Yeah.
You may have mentioned this, but what do you suggest for clients who have trauma, but you're also facing the same trauma yourself? For example, law enforcement. How do you tell someone to trust law enforcement if you don't?
Yeah, that's a great. So if I don't trust law enforcement, I wouldn't say that because it's going to come across as very inauthentic. So I would say the first thing is to make sure you are really regulated, because I've had that experience where I have stuff that's very similar to the person I'm trying to help. And so before I enter that room, before I talk, before I do anything, I have to make sure I'm in a good spot. And there's sometimes I'm not. And then I just say hey, can we reschedule for tomorrow or something like that,
Well, one thing is, so when I was working in refugee settlement, first thing you do is when you pick them up from the airport and you take them to their home, and they're like, if there's in case of emergency, you tell them to call 911. So how does that come out of your mouth?
Yeah, when you're like, I don't know if that's going to benefit
You're pretty much
you.
lying to yourself.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's okay to, you can say, I would be careful what you say in that, right? I wouldn't say, call 911 and they will help you, because you don't know that's always true. So you can say, 911 is supposed to help you. 911 is there to assist you sometimes. I truly believe being honest is really important. So, and the language that we use, especially with people who don't share the same language, is really tricky. But trying to help people understand that it doesn't always work that way. I tell that about people with in police as well. I'm like, sometimes a police officer is going to help you, and sometimes they're not. It just depends. And when you get a good one who wants to help you, that's awesome. And sometimes when you get a bad one, then we got to talk about what you do in that situation, because how you act may affect the situation, right? So I just try to be really honest. We want, if there's an emergency, for them to access the emergency services, but we don't want them to go away with the idea that it's just this magical thing and you get everything you need, because we know that's not true. So I would just try to think about language and trying to find something that feels authentic enough to you, but isn't feel like a lie, because sometimes it feels like that. Yeah.
I know we talk about authenticity, and I want to see, to what extent it's, because I know your clients are just talking to you, and they're just it's a lot of kind of emotions they're sharing, and obviously it can affect you, right? It's hard to kind of just keep up this, they're crying in front of you, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess how do you
question, and I wish I had like a really concrete answer, but I think it depends. And I think what you always have to ask yourself is this more for me or more for them? Because sometimes when we're in it and we're feeling all that stuff, I sometimes want to hug that person because it makes me feel better. You know, like, I feel like I'm doing something. So I think it's about being conscious of your boundaries and why you're doing what you're doing. There are times when I'm in counseling and therapy and stuff that I hear stories that I cannot stop myself from crying. Like, I just can't. And I'm gonna look crazy if I try, because I'm going, you know. And I say, I'm feeling what you're feeling so much that I'm gonna start crying too. And I just want, you know, and then I cry a little bit and I'm like, oh, that's really intense, right? Or, wow, something you're saying to me is really making me feel that emotion. And I'm tearing up right now. So that, and you know, it's about thinking through how it comes across, how you can acknowledge it's happening. You know, people that start crying and then someone says, why are you crying? You're like, no, I'm not, it's fine. You know, that's the stuff, right? You gotta go, yeah, what you said really hit me. And now I'm kind of feeling teary. So I think that's a good thing. And then just thinking about the boundaries, like, is it about me or is it about them? And sometimes you don't know. And then you just have to be like, I don't know who this is about. And just trying to work that out in the moment. And then I'll tell you, oftentimes you learn through that process. And then you'll be like, wow, I cried with them, and it was really about my shit. Sorry, of course, not theirs. And, you know, and then I'm like, okay, I gotta work on that in myself and my professional self, because that was about me, not them. But remembering we work with people, we work with humans that experience things, and we experience them, and sometimes we're experiencing them together, so it's not so clear. You know, but trying to be professional and respectful is the key, but easier said than done.
And I think another piece to that I've experienced is at that moment, like if I'm overtaken by what's happening, I don't want them to feel like they need to take care of me.
Yes.
I never want, it's like, you know, someone's riding their bike, they get hit by a car, they're hurt. The person in the car has to now be consoled by the person that they just hit.
Yes.
So I think where you're now the person that they're taking care of, and that's not really what you want to happen.
I'm really glad you said that, because it is true. It's about knowing where your stuff ends and theirs begins. And we don't want to put that on other people. And because of that concept of trauma mastery that I was talking about, we come to this work with something in us that feeds some of that. So you got to be constantly thoughtful of, my job, their job isn't to take care of me, I'm supposed to take care of them. And I have to be in the best space to do that. And sometimes I've had it where clients start trying to take care of me, and I acknowledge that. Like, oh, you don't need to take care of me. Yeah, I'm having a reaction to what you said, and it's making me sad, but I'm good. You don't need to take care of me. Let's talk about how I can help you through this process. And just saying it out loud, we sometimes don't say stuff, which I think is funny, you know? Like, just call it out. You know? Just say it. I don't know. I'm losing my mind right now. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I'm glad you said that. Well, I think we're out of time. I think we've been over time. I apologize. Sometimes you give me a mic, I can't stop.
Technically scheduled till 12:30.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Any other questions then, before we wrap up? Okay, I want to end with, since now I have 12:30, I want to end with a little passage that I like to read at the end. So this is from a book called True Refuge, and it's by Tara Brach. I don't know if anyone knows Tara Brach's work. But she has this beautiful way of describing kind of what trauma does for us in a metaphor. So she says, imagine that at the moment of birth we begin to develop a spacesuit to help us navigate our strange new environment. The purpose of this spacesuit is to protect us from violence and greed, and to win nurturance from caretakers who, to varying degrees, are bound by their own self-absorption and insecurities. When our needs aren't met, our spacesuit creates the best defensive and proactive strategies it can. These include tensions in the body and emotions such as anger, anxiety, and shame, mental activities such as judging, obsessing, and fantasizing, and a whole array of behavioral tactics for going after what is missing, security, food, love. Our spacesuit is essential for survival, and some of its strategies do help us become productive, stable, and responsible adults. And yet the same spacesuit that protects us can also prevent us from moving spontaneously, joyfully, and freely through our lives. This is when our spacesuit becomes our prison. Our sense of who we are becomes defined by the spacesuit's doings, its strengths, its weaknesses. We become identified with our skill in problem solving or communicating, identify with our judgments, our obsessions, identify with our anxieties, our anger, or our wrongdoings. Identify means that we think we are the spacesuit. It appears to us that we actually are the self who possesses the anxiety and the anger. We are the self who judges. We are the self who others admire. And we are the self who is special or imperfect and alone. When we become infused with the spacesuit, we begin living in what I call a trance, and our sense of who we are is radically contracted. We have forgotten who is gazing through the spacesuit's mask. We have forgotten our vast heart and our awareness. We have forgotten the mysterious presence that is always here behind any passing emotion, thought, or action. And what I love about that is it just takes it out of the context of that we are those things. We are the trauma that happened to us. We are the bad things that we did in response to that trauma. Because that's the spacesuit. That's not who's inside that spacesuit. And I always feel like our work is helping people realize that they're not the spacesuit. There's a human being with a vast heart inside, and that sometimes we have to help people remind themselves that you're not what your doings are, right? So I always like to end that because I think it's a nice metaphor and is a protective way of demonstrating how people have managed their lives and the things that they faced. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. Thanks. Thank you.
Is this on? I'm a fellow microphone lover myself.
We're kind of rare.
Oh, we are. We are rare unicorns. Thank you so much. I feel so awkward in here with this. I know, right? Thank you. This was just an amazing presentation. We're so thankful for you coming here. Hopefully we can have you come join us again.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We just wanted to end in a little song, a little happy birthday song for our fearless leader. It is Rick's birthday today.